If you comb through the earliest records of colonial America, you will find free black people living where slavery was not enforced. Not on plantations, not in European towns, but on native land. No debate, no explanation, just presence. Spanish, British, and French colonial reports from the 1600s list settlements of Africans living among native nations. The language is plain, Negro towns. Free blacks among the Indians. Runaways settled in Indian country. The writers do not pause to justify it. They record it as fact. These were not isolated individuals. They were communities, families, villages, entire settlements located beyond the reach of colonial law. Africans who escaped bondage did not vanish into wilderness. They went where freedom already existed, indigenous territory. In Spanish Florida, colonial correspondence repeatedly mentions Africans living alongside Seminole, Creek, and other southeastern nations. Some had escaped British plantations. Others were born free. They farmed land. They hunted. They raised children. They formed alliances. Spanish officials referred to these communities without alarm. British officials did not. By the early 1700s, British records from South Carolina and Georgia describe fortified black settlements deep in swamps and forests controlled by native nations. These were places slave patrols could not enter. The reports complained that enslaved Africans were fleeing to the Indians in large numbers. The problem was not escape, it was sanctuary. In these settlements, black people were not property. They paid tribute in crops. They bore arms. They defended territory. They lived under indigenous law. U.S. military correspondents later referred to them as Negro allies of the Indians, not slaves, allies. The Seminole Nation provides the clearest record. Federal military documents from the early 1800s repeatedly note free black towns on Seminole land. These towns were autonomous. They had their own, leaders. They negotiated directly with native chiefs. American officers complained that these black communities encouraged rebellion and escape. They were correct. These settlements were living proof that black people could exist free, organized, and armed without white oversight. And that freedom existed because native land made it possible. Early census fragments confirm this reality. In the late 1700s and early 1800s, some enumerators listed individuals as free Negro living with Indians or black Indian. No footnotes, no definitions. It required no explanation at the time. Land deeds from frontier regions show African-descended families farming native territory with permission and protection from tribal governments. Church records document black congregations worshiping in native towns. Marriage records list unions across African and indigenous families. This was not social collapse. It was coexistence. But as the United States expanded, tolerance ended. The new nation could not allow free black communities to exist outside its control, especially on land it wanted. Native sovereignty and black freedom became linked threats. They had to be separated. The solution was not immediate violence, it was reclassification. After 1800, federal records began changing language. Where earlier documents listed free black people on native land plainly, later paperwork grew vague. Categories narrowed. Overlaps disappeared. Black Indian became inconvenient. Indian removal in the 1830s did more than relocate tribes. It dismantled the geography of black freedom. When native nations were forced west, black communities were dragged with them, often stripped of their status along the way. Some who had lived free for generations were suddenly labeled enslaved. Others were redefined as dependents. Many were reduced to a new category that erased their past entirely. Freedmen. The word implied former enslavement, even when none had existed. The Trail of Tears carried black families whose freedom had never depended on emancipation. It depended on land, and that land was being taken. In Indian Territory, black communities rebuilt again. They farmed, they established schools, they paid taxes, they lived as citizens of native nations. The records still show it. But the paperwork was catching up. By the late 1800s, the federal government no longer tolerated ambiguity. Land had to be divided, people had to be sorted, identity had to be fixed. What followed was not accidental erasure. It was administrative design. By the late 1800s, the United States faced a problem it had created. Millions of acres of native land remained outside full federal control, and living on that land were black communities who had never been enslaved by the United States, never emancipated by it, and never authorized by it. Their freedom did not come from law. It came from geography. That could not stand. In 1887, Congress passed the Dawes Act. On paper, it was a land reform policy. In practice, it was a sorting machine. Communal native land would be broken into individual allotments. Every person would be listed, every identity fixed, every name placed on a roll. This was not just about land, it was about classification. To receive land, a person had to be recorded on an official roll. The Dawes Commission invented categories to do the work: by blood, freedmen; intermarried white; adopted. Each label carried consequences. Black citizens of native nations were rarely placed on the by blood rolls, even when their families had lived in those nations for generations. Instead, they were assigned to the freedman rolls. The designation followed ancestry, not citizenship. It followed race, not community. On paper, this separation looked administrative. In reality, it severed history. Families were split across categories. Siblings received different legal identities. One person received land, another did not. One inherited, another was erased. The records show it clearly. Applications where black citizens testified to native parents, native language, native land use, examiners dismissed it. The decision had already been made. This paperwork turned free black communities into temporary occupants of land they had defended, farmed, and governed for decades. When allotment ended, surplus land was declared unused. It was sold. It was seized. It was open to white settlement. Black families were pushed off land they had never lost in battle. Some survived by chance. In Oklahoma, oil was discovered beneath allotments held by freedmen descendants. For a brief moment, black families held legal deeds to valuable land. They built schools, businesses, banks, neighborhoods. Greenwood was one of them. It rose not from slavery, but from land allotments tied to native territory. Many of its residents traced their freedom back to Indian land. That detail is rarely included in textbooks. In 1921, Greenwood was destroyed. Over 2 days, white mobs burned 35 blocks to the ground. Homes, churches, businesses, records, deeds, insurance documents, family papers, all lost. The destruction was not only physical, it completed the work paperwork had begun. Without documents, land claims vanished. Ownership disappeared. Legal identity dissolved. Paper erasure prepared the ground. Fire finished it. What survived lived in memory. Throughout the 20th century, black descendants of native communities fought to be recognized. They petitioned tribes. They filed lawsuits. They produced treaties, census pages, church rolls, marriage records. The evidence existed. The categories did not allow it. Tribal constitutions written during the Dawes era still govern citizenship today. Many still rely on blood quantum systems created by the federal government. Freedmen descendants remain excluded despite treaty guarantees. In 2017, a federal court ruled that the Cherokee Nation must honor the citizenship rights of freedmen descendants under the 1866 treaty. The ruling did not restore land. It did not restore history. It only acknowledged what had always been true. Black people were part of these nations. The fight continues. In the 2020 census, thousands of people who identify as both black and native were forced to choose one box. Some were counted incorrectly, others not at all. The categories remain narrow. The consequences remain real. DNA tests provide answers for some. For others, they complicate the record. Not every family history fits a laboratory result. Not every truth appears in genetic code. Oral history still carries what documents erased. Family Bibles, land stories, names passed down, places remembered. The first free black communities in America were not accidents. They were not exceptions. They were built on native land because native land made freedom possible. That truth survived war, removal, fire, and law, but it did not survive paperwork unchallenged. Erasure did not happen because these communities disappeared. It happened because the nation decided not to see them. As long as history is written by categories that exclude overlap, people who live between systems will remain invisible. Not gone, just undocumented. The story is not finished. It is still waiting in ledgers, in court filings, in family memory, in land beneath towns that no longer exist. Freedom did not begin on plantations. For many Black Americans, it began on native land, and it was taken away with a pen.